So Chicago, guys, has two very notorious distinctions, okay, that the city would be better without. One is that it's the most segregated city in America, okay, and we see this on the South Side. If you guys drive through the South Side, you can see like there's clear boundaries between black, brown, white neighborhoods. Now up north, that's not so much the case. Up north, between brown, white, and Asian, those three races are integrated up north, and there's some black up north. But there are huge swaths of the South Side where it's like all black, and then huge swaths where it's all brown. And then in like the Bridgeport area and some of the areas on the Southwest Side in the Gage Park neighborhood and stuff like that, you do have like brown and white mixed communities around there. But between black, brown, and white, and mainly between African American, okay, on the South Side, there's very distinct, stark segregation. Okay, now a lot of the black folks that are up north are immigrants and are not, from the same ethnicity as African Americans. So that is something also that should be noted because, the segregation is even more stark than some people, might visually see it when they see all the black people up north. A lot of those are Jamaicans and Haitians and Nigerians and stuff like that. So it is very segregated. The second distinction that Chicago has, okay, that's very bad, is being the gang capital of really America. Okay, we have approximately 150,000 gang members in the city, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000. Now that's just a sheer number, okay, makes us the gang capital, and on top of that, we are much smaller population-wise than LA and New York City, so per capita, I mean, we're talking like there's a huge percentage of gang members here. So these two things, these two statistics, if you want to call it, being segregated and being the gang capital, are connected. They're directly connected. And when one reads the history of the city, we can see that the gang presence here actually was the main cause of the segregation from the start. A lot of times when people look at how segregated Chicago is, they assume that the government or that the rich or that the upper class of society, planned it to be like this from the start intentionally as a way to keep the black population down, as a way to enforce white supremacy. But people that say that are not really looking at the historical unfolding of the segregation of the city and how exactly it took place, because it was actually the opposite. The rich factory owners here and the rich business owners here wanted black folks to come here and to live in areas where they would easily be able to access their factories and the places where they wanted to employ them, because the black population that started to come to Chicago in the early part of the 20th century was a labor source that to them, that to the rich, okay, here was preferable to European immigrants because of the fact that the black workers that started to come up around this time, especially in the early part of the 20th century and then in the immediate aftermath of World War I, these black workers were not at that time part of labor unions, okay? They were not unionized. That was very important because it made them basically easier to give like lower wages and easier to make money off of them, right? I mean, you're talking about like movements that were coming out of Central and Eastern Europe at that time, communism. And, this was decades before, but, it was really starting to gain steam here in the United States around this time. These labor movements, the workers were unionizing and they were trying to negotiate for better wages, better conditions, and that meant lower profits for the factory owners. Okay, so the factory owners, they didn't want to have to deal with that, right? So when black migrants started to come up from the South, it was like a dream to them because they didn't have to pay these people as much. They didn't have to give them as good working conditions. You know what I'm saying? And so it basically offered them a solution to the problem of these unions. As far as like wanting, to keep them away or whatever, that was not the case. They actually wanted them here. Okay, and the NAACP said that Chicago was one of the most progressive cities in the country as far as not having segregation and as far as having integrated neighborhoods prior to World War I. Okay, now at that time, Chicago's black population was only about 44,000 people, and they were a small percentage of the population here. But the NAACP at that time said that Chicago was a very progressive city and was not segregated compared to other cities in America. In the South, segregation was heavy at this time, right? The KKK was very strong, and, all the laws coming down to basically keep black people segregated and keep them down in the South, that was like in full force at this time, right? So Chicago was seen as like the opposite of that. It was seen as a progressive city. So how did Chicago switch to become, from one of the most progressive cities in the country to one of the least progressive cities, most segregated cities. Well, it started around the time of the Great Migration, okay, which started in the early part of the 20th century that I've talked about a little bit in previous videos. And Chicago at this time, guys, was, like I said, and I've mentioned this a million times, but I need to repeat it to kind of set the scene for this. It was a city of European immigrants, and on the south side, Irish. Okay, now this is very important, man, because this is a different ethnic dynamic than black people were dealing with in the South with the, mainly Anglo-Saxon whites down there. Okay, at this time, the concept of race in America was way different than it is now. So the Irish were deep on the South side. Now, what were the Irish on at this time? Like, what was their situation? This is really important to understand because they had just come over here from Europe. And back in Europe, they were dealing with a lot of oppression in their conflict with the British, okay, and with their conflict with, the Anglo-Saxons back there. The Irish are not Anglo-Saxons, okay? The Irish are Celtic. That's a different gene pool than Anglo-Saxons in Europe. And, they had their political conflict with them. And they came over here and were like not going to deal with any of that over here. Like over here, they were like, we came all the way over here from Ireland. We're not going to take the same kind of crap that we took back there. So they established territories on the south side, and they formed these things that they referred to as athletic clubs, but really were street gangs to protect their neighborhoods. And they beefed very heavily with Anglo-Saxon whites at this time. That was a huge conflict. They beefed with the KKK. The KKK hated them. And the presence of the Irish here for black people ended up being a two-edged sword because on the one hand, it caused conflict with them, but they kept the KKK out. And the KKK at this time was a real threat to black people in America. I mean, they were doing lynchings all over the South. So the Irish keeping them out, that was a plus. Okay, the Irish were not as big of a problem for them that the KKK would have been. And the KKK hated the Irish because, one, the Irish were not Anglo-Saxons, okay, and they had that beef, that ethnic beef. But two, the Irish were Catholics, and the KKK hated Catholics. They did not want America to be a Catholic country. They wanted it to be a Protestant nation. That was very important. It was important as far as like the ideology that they wanted, the United States to follow. And they didn't want any allegiance to the church or anything like that. So the Irish being Catholics, that caused enmity between them and, the established foundational whites that were here. So the Irish, they were very territorial on the south side, and was not just against black people. Okay, they formed their neighborhoods, and they wanted to keep their neighborhoods Irish. That was very important. They wanted to have their communities. They formed gangs to protect their communities. One of the gangs I talked about in a previous video, you can go check that out. It was called the Reagan's Colts. They had a territory between Ashland Avenue and Cottage Grove, and then between, I think, 43rd and 63rd. So that's a pretty large territory on the south side of Chicago. That was one of the most notorious gangs they had. Another one was the Hamburg Athletic Association. That was it was an athletic club, but it was really a street gang, of which, okay, they had one particular member, Richard J. Daley, who eventually became the mayor of Chicago. He was 17 during the summer of 1919 at a time when the race riot that I'm going to talk about in this video broke out. So he was he was a teenager at that time, but he was a member of this group. Okay, and this was a group also. I'm not exactly sure where their territory was on the south side, but them, the Reagan's Colts, and several other Irish gangs, they protected these territories against anybody, not just black people. If you were Polish, if you were Italian, anything, if you were anything besides Irish. And even if you were Irish, but you weren't cool with their particular gang, like you had to know somebody, you had to be down with them, you had to be cool with them, and you had to, basically have a hood pass to come into their neighborhood. This went for anybody, okay? And they defended their territory fiercely because they were not going to be exploited the way that they were back in Ireland by the British, okay? So that's what they were on over here. So black people started to come up from the south, right? Now, these black people coming up from the south, we're talking like in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, they were used to like some serious oppression in the South. You know what I'm saying? I mean, a lot of these black people had, parents that had been slaves, grandparents that had been slaves, and even some of them, had been slaves personally, some of the older ones, right? So they're coming up from the South, and they were on something different than, the black people who, sometimes the way that they're looked at in movies and stuff like that, during the slave generations, these black people were, a lot of them, veterans of war, okay? And they were basically on the same thing as the Irish. I hear a lot of black people today saying things like, we're not our grandparents, we're going to fight back. I've even seen shirts that say this, like, we're not our grandparents or whatever, like, we're going to fight. When I see this, it's kind of like ironic because like these people are, I don't know if they've read history or what, but their grandparents fought more than they did. Okay. And the black people in the early part of the 20th century were armed, and they were definitely like, they had a militant mindset. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of these black people were coming back from World War I. But even before that, a lot of these were Civil War veterans, and, they were basically not the way that they're portrayed in movies a lot of times, which is where, okay, we're just going to let people enslave us and we don't care because, that's what we're supposed to do. Like, no, they were not on that at all, man. Like, they were up here. And at this time, you got to remember, too, in American history, it wasn't certain that slavery wasn't going to come back, right? I mean, we take it for granted today that it didn't come back, but at that time, who knew that it wasn't going to come back? It's easy to look at that in hindsight, but if you're a black person who's been a slave, you know what I'm saying, and now you're a freed slave, you're coming up to the north, you don't have any guarantee that they're not going to try and do that again. Black people that were migrating north from the south kind of had like an immigrant mentality, because you got to look really at the south and as the north as almost like two separate nations back then culturally, okay? I mean, it really is some extent even to today, but it almost became that, right? And immigrants are not a random sample of the population. There are certain character traits that cause a person to get up from their home country and leave to go somewhere else to a strange land and try to make a better life for themselves. So it requires like a more motivated individual to do something like that. And these black people that were migrating from the south, they were on a lot of the same stuff that you see immigrants on today, like very motivated, okay, and like trying to make it in this new place. So they came up from the south and they encountered this patchwork of European immigrant gangs in the city of Chicago. Now, street gangs was something that they hadn't dealt with in the South, right? Like they didn't know what this was. Like there was this totally new concept to them. And this concept that you can't go into this guy's neighborhood, you know what I'm saying? And it's not because, you've had any conflict with him in the past, or it's not because, you are trying to steal something from him or anything like that. It's just because that's his hood. You know what I'm saying? This was like a new concept. Okay, because in the South, it wasn't like that with the hoods. You had the plantations and you had the towns and everything, but it wasn't like in Chicago with these hoods and gang territories. So they ran into a lot of conflicts initially because of this. Now, like I said, the Irish on the South Side, they were doing this to everybody, not just black folks. And not just the Irish, every European immigrant group. Like if you came into their neighborhood, they would get down on you, if you didn't know any of them. So black people, they started, sometimes running into these guys, and guys were getting down on them. So black people didn't really, though, form like a lot of well-known gangs around this time, at least not that was documented by the courts. In one of the documents that came out around the time of 1919, in the aftermath of Chicago's racial conflict that took place in this particular summer, the historians had marked around that time that the black folks didn't really have any like well-defined gangs. There were kind of like, groups of guys who would just get together, at the spur of the moment, armed groups or whatever, but it wasn't like the same as the Irish and the Polish and the Italians that had these gangs with names and structures and all that kind of thing. Around this time, they hadn't really formed that yet. They said the vast majority of the gangs in the city, like the organized gangs, were white gangs, okay, European gangs. So black people come up, they don't have gangs, okay, at this time. So, but they've got to deal with these European gangs, okay. So they eventually formed like a strip of territory where they resided, and it was known as the Black Belt on the South Side, okay. Now, some of the neighborhoods around this time on the South Side were integrated, and they had black and white residents mixed in. This was going to, be a source of conflict later on, but like I said, the factory owners were happy to have them here because of the fact that, they didn't have to deal with these white unions, okay, with the black workers. They could bring the black workers in when the white unions would try to strike, and so the strike wouldn't be able to be effective. So this caused a lot of tension, though, okay, because, the unions are trying to get these things accomplished, and the black workers are being used by these factory owners to basically negate everything that the unions were trying to get done. On top of that, with World War I, okay, a lot of the whites and a lot of the, people that had come over here in recent years went over to Europe to fight, right? Okay, during that time, the factory owners brought in a lot of black migrants and gave the jobs that had previously been held by the whites to these black workers. When the white workers came back from World War I, they found that they no longer had their jobs because they had been filled by these black workers. So that created a huge amount of resentment, okay, and racial tension right there. Now, nothing really super violent happened prior to the summer of 1919, but tensions were growing because of all this, okay? Now, a lot of these jobs were in the stockyards on the south side and in the factories on the south side. And a lot of black people, like I said, the factory owners, they wanted them to live in close proximity to these plants. So the white people that were part of these unions and the white workers down there, they would get into like little stuff here and there with the black workers, but it was nothing major. But it was getting tenser and tenser, as the black workers and the white workers competed for these jobs. It was mainly an economic problem, okay, because competition for jobs was what was creating the beef. So in the summer of 1919, and we're approaching the anniversary of this, hopefully I can get the video dropped before this anniversary. It was on July 27th of 1919. There was a beach, okay, over at, I believe, 29th Street. And this beach had the same rules as the streets, okay, in Chicago. And it was not official. It was like unofficial, basically set by the streets that, we're going to stay over here in our hood, you're going to stay over there in your hood, and same thing with the beach. We're going to stay on this part of the beach, you're going to stay on that part of the beach. And everybody knew the rules. It was like, Irish, black, Polish, Lithuanian, whatever, like everybody got their section. You don't come into our section, we don't come into your section. But there was one particular black youth who was at the beach on that particular day, Eugene Williams. And he was on a raft that he was holding onto by a railroad tie. And there was a white male at the beach, and the exact age of the guy, to be honest with you, haven't been able to find out. But he was at the beach, and according to a witness, this guy Eugene Williams, on his raft, the black guy started to drift over into the white territory of the beach. Now, historians generally agree that this was probably not intentional, that he was probably carried by the current of the lake, okay, and that he probably was not doing this to try and instigate anything or challenge the white beachgoers by coming into their side, but it was probably just an accident, or he probably couldn't stop it from the current of Lake Michigan. So one of the white guys at the beach though took some rocks and started chucking them at this guy, according to a witness. One of the rocks hit him. And what the witness described was that after the rock hit this guy Eugene in the head, he lost hold of the railroad tie and fell into the lake and drowned in the lake. So that set off what was going to become a huge race riot, okay? But what happened in the immediate aftermath was that the cops refused to arrest the guy that had thrown the rock, okay? Despite the fact that some people at the beach were pointing him out, they refused to arrest him and instead arrested some black guy, in connection with something else that had happened at the beach. And also at the exact same time that this was going on, there was another brawl going on down the street at another part of the beach, because apparently some black people had tried to go into the white section of the beach over there and defy the unofficial segregation of the beach. And so a fight was breaking out over there. So this thing happened with this guy getting killed, okay, by drowning in the lake over at this part of the beach, or by 29th Street, and that brawl was going over at the other section of the beach at the same time, and things just exploded, okay? It turned into all-out mayhem, because this was like the spark that just ignited the gasoline, because all the tension that had been building and all the conflicts that had been going on in the neighborhoods, at that point, it just exploded, and the whites started to attack the black beachgoers, and it turned into an all-out, one of the biggest brawls that Chicago's ever seen, okay? Now, on top of that, a lot of the black folks, they started fighting back. So in the aftermath of this incident at the beach, fighting broke out all over the South Side, and what happened was that the South Side gangs, mainly the Irish gangs, started doing a new thing, a new kind of attack in the black neighborhoods, which was the drive-by, okay, and doing drive-by shootings. And this was something that, apparently they hadn't really been doing too much before, but now it started to happen. And at the end of this conflict, there were 23 black people killed and 15 all Irish killed. Okay, I believe it was all Irish. Now, there was a very complicated situation going on here because, like I said, Chicago was divided ethnically among the Europeans. And this was mainly like an Irish on black conflict. And the Irish had beef with these other European groups. And they were not coming into the conflict on the side of the Irish. And the Irish were trying to get them to come into the conflict to help them. So they actually tried attacking, and this was a very strange turn of events. Some of the Irish gangs actually tried attacking Italian and Polish homes, okay, in like, their neighborhoods in blackface to try to make them think that the black people had attacked those neighborhoods so that they would come into the war on the side of the Irish. But it didn't work, okay, because they called their bluff. They figured out what had happened, and the Italians didn't see it as their problem, okay, at this time. They were like separate from this, and this was like a South Side thing between the Irish and the blacks, so they didn't come in on the side of the war. Neither did the Polish. It ended up mainly just being an Irish gang versus black thing. And again, the blacks didn't really have gangs at this time. It was mainly just Irish street gangs versus black residents. But the black residents also started attacking any Irish person that would come through their neighborhood, and they showed some pretty intricate knowledge of the city's politics at this time, because they were not attacking like whites of other ethnic groups. It was just Irish that were coming through their neighborhoods, and all the casualties ended up being Irish. So that was, this was one of Chicago's first early big race wars, man. It was not the biggest that we've ever had in Chicago history. That was a conflict between the Irish and the Italians, but as far as property damage, it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, because there were 1,000 homes destroyed, most of them of black residents. There were 567 people that were injured, about 2/3 of them black, 1/3 of them white. And like I said, there were like 38 people killed total, 23 black and 15 Irish. So the blacks, a lot of these were World War I veterans, what I'm saying? So they were fighting back, and they were definitely fighting back, man. And it turned into a situation where from that period on, really, you couldn't go into another racist neighborhood in Chicago. You know what I'm saying? You couldn't. This lasted for decades. You know what I'm saying? And this incident was really the thing that really kind of cemented Chicago's segregation. Because even if it wasn't official, even if it wasn't planned by the government, who wanted to take that risk after something like this? You know what I'm saying? After a situation where anybody going into anybody else's neighborhood was going to be shot, not only beaten, but shot on sight. If you were Irish going into a black neighborhood, or if you were black coming into an Irish neighborhood, you were going to get shot on sight. So try telling people after this that, everything's cool now, it's okay to go back into their neighborhood. So Chicago's segregation really got cemented at this point, man. At least between Irish and black on the south side, but really between other white groups too. You're going to take the risk that, they're not going to mistake you for an Irish person or whatever. Chicago from this point on, man, until today. And, it's gotten a lot better. In this day and age, a black person can come through a white neighborhood, a white person can go through a black neighborhood. And, unless it's like some crime of opportunity or something like that, like a robbery or carjacking, some economically related stuff, in most cases, nothing's going to happen. You know what I'm saying? You still might get, people like looking at you like, what are you doing here or something like that, but it's nothing like what was going on back then. Okay. And the Reagan's Colts gang, the Hamburg Club were the two main gangs involved in this. Okay. So eventually the Hamburg Club gang, that actually went political. Okay. And Mayor J. Daley, who was Mayor Richard J. Daley, who was, one of the members of that club at that time, he eventually became, one of Chicago's most successful mayors. And he inspired actually Larry Hoover and some of the other black gang leaders in Chicago, because, they saw how he transitioned into politics, and they wanted to take that same path. Now, it didn't end up working for them, partly because of the law, but partly, too, because a lot of their guys started going renegade. Okay, GDs didn't want to pay dues, you know what I'm saying? Kiloward was actually the first neighborhood to go renegade and not want to pay dues like that. But guys started breaking off, and the unity kind of fell apart. It wasn't there. But also, the government had a part in breaking apart the unity too amongst the gangs, between the gangs, not within the GDs, but like amongst the gangs, like when the Black Panthers try to unite everybody and stuff like that. The government was, being subversive throughout that entire period. But from the start, though, okay, the black people had started to come up here from the South, man. There was conflict in the streets. And the black population had doubled, okay, actually more than doubled. It had gone from like 44,000 up to 100,000 around the time of World War I, okay, and in the immediate aftermath. But after this happened, black folks then, they got on something totally different, in Chicago when they became exposed to these street gangs. But that race riot of 1919, it really caused an irreparable rift that lasts until today. And they found in the aftermath that a lot of the police had allegiances. A lot of the police were Irish and had allegiances to the Irish neighborhoods and the Irish street gangs, and were not arresting like any white participants in the riot. And at one point, even the juries, okay, that were like trying the black rioters that had been arrested, they were like, where are all the white rioters? And at one point they refused to try any more of the black rioters, because they were like, the black people weren't rioting amongst themselves, like who was fighting with them, you know what I'm saying? So until they presented some white rioters, they refused to try any more of the black rioters. And in the aftermath, they actually had a lot of meetings in the government, and the mayor at the time was a guy named Bill Thompson. And, so he was actually having kind of like a beef with the governor at that time. And he didn't want the governor to send in the National Guard, but the governor eventually did that. And they formed like a protective barrier around the black section of the South Side to protect them. They brought in machine gun units. It was something like 6,000 National Guard troops to protect them. And then there were also some whites that were like kind of like trying to help the black side out, especially, like I said, the factory owners, because they wanted them here. So they were delivering food to them and stuff like that, coming through basically the Irish neighborhoods to get food to the black residents. So eventually it died down that way, but it took the National Guard for it to stop. President at that time was Woodrow Wilson, and he publicly blamed the white residents of Chicago for instigating this, you know what I'm saying, which, I mean, they did. I mean, at that beach and even before that, just the dynamics of the streets and everything, it definitely instigated it. And he blamed them, and they created like a commission to try to, investigate the causes of this riot in the aftermath and try to decide what to do about it in the future. And, there was a debate going back and forth, like, should we segregate Chicago officially from this point on to try to keep, these two races apart and try to keep the peace? And, the black residents and some of the liberal whites, they did not want that, you know what I'm saying? They wanted Chicago to be integrated, and they wanted to move into the white neighborhoods. But eventually, like I said, because of the gang conflicts, that couldn't be the case, even till today. You know what I'm saying? You see in Chicago, like, that can't be the case in a lot, even like between the members of the same race, like, what I'm saying, with brown, with black, and, really up until like the 90s with white. If you've got a child or whatever who's in one gang and, you want to move into another gang's territory, you can't do that, right? You can't even send them to the same school in that district, what I'm saying, if your child gets involved with one particular gang. Well, with the gangs being divided ethnically, okay, and racially, it was the same situation. What I'm saying? Are you going to move into this neighborhood when your kid is a member of this gang, and, there's a black gang over there, and, they're going to get into it with him? Like, no, you can't do that. So it has to be segregated because of the streets. That was really what was causing this whole problem. The commission, which was actually composed of 6 white and 6 black members, that was brought together to investigate the cause of this, found that it was mainly economic. That was the chief thing. It was this competition for jobs. This was what was creating all the tension. And, that's something that even till today, I mean, continues to be a problem. Like in the low income jobs, when people, like I said, in the labor market today, like, don't have a specialized skill and they need to compete for these jobs that really anybody can do, creates fierce competition and resentment. What I'm saying? And I mean, even from the slavery days until today, economics has always been at the heart of racial tension. That money, that green is at the end of the day the most important color. And when that green is threatened, people are willing to go to war with other groups, because Chicago and the United States really in general has always been kind of like a competition, an arena of competition for money, amongst various groups, man, and they fight for it fiercely. And this is one of the many evils that competition for that money and those jobs created in Chicago, man. So can it happen again? Yes. I mean, sure. As long as money is still around and greed and, people trying to compete for that, it can definitely still happen again. So the tension, especially between the Irish and the black communities on the South Side, did not end, anywhere near the point at which this riot ended. I mean, it continued for decades after. It kind of left a bad taste in the black community's mouth, and a lot of the Irish became police officers, which, increased tensions even more, man. But today, this is not even something that you would notice in Chicago, man. You see black people going to the St. Patrick's Day parade. They have, friends back and forth. I mean, the Irish live in the Bridgeport neighborhood still a lot even to today, man. And there's like zero tension today. People go into each other's neighborhoods all the time now, and it's not a problem. But historically, that's there, and the tremendous irony in this whole thing is that, when black folks came up from the South, they didn't have gang culture. And the Irish did, okay? The Irish and the Italians did. And today, despite all of the, bad blood that was created around that time, the black community has pretty much adopted the Irish culture, okay, as far as the streets. Like, they've become what the Irish used to be on the South Side, and even taking it to a step beyond that, probably, because all the stuff that you see them doing today, with the hand signs and with the lingo and with all that kind of thing, the Irish really created this whole culture. Not just them, the other European immigrant groups too, but the Irish really holding that down and enforcing that and spreading that on the South Side of Chicago, man. And the black community today has really adopted a culture that at one time was against them. You know what I'm saying? They've actually become what were originally their rivals when they came into the city of Chicago. And it's very ironic to see them doing a lot of the things today that, the Irish used to do back in the day, as far as gang wars, because this gang thing, it was something that wasn't in, the Jim Crow South, but it was up here, okay, and now it's really all over the country and even all over the world, okay, but it started all the way back then, and actually even before that. But gang culture, man, it creates a lot of problems for people that have nothing to do with it. You know what I'm saying? It draws people that are just civilians into it because it starts beef, okay, and that beef spreads like a ripple in a pond, man. Unfortunately, this continues till today in Chicago, man. This is your boy Winnie Cedar Report. I'm out.